Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pei Liu, and I am an associate professor in the Division of Applied Social Sciences, and I am pleased to serve as the moderator for today's Katherine Research Council webinar. And I am delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Katherine Nelson, an associate professor in the School of Natural Resources. Dr. Nelson's research examines the joint influences of environmental hazards, land use, and socioeconomic conditions in social environmental systems. Her work aims to identify policy and practice solutions that promote social equity while ensuring the preservation of natural resources and ecosystems for future generations. Today, Dr. Nelson will present on trends in diversity of agricultural landscapes. So before we begin, please note that we will hold a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. You are encouraged to submit questions using the Q&A feature, and we will address as many as time allows. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Nelson.
Thank you very much. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen here. Does that look right? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to the Research Council group here today. I'm Kate Nelson, and my research really focuses on sustainability of communities and agricultural landscapes. I've titled this talk Trends in Diversity of Agricultural Landscapes, in part because it's pretty broad. It allows me to talk about kind of wander around and the things that I'm interested here, thinking about temporal trends, but also spatial patterns and relationships that have to do with really the diversity of land uses that we see across agricultural landscapes. And so this work that I'm talking about has been motivated by previous studies. Notably, there was a paper by Jonathan Aguilar in 2015 that talked about declining crop diversity across the US. The image you see here is from a more recent study by Michael Crossley at University of Delaware, looking at the diversity of crops that have been grown in the US from 1860 to 2017. And so our color bar here is showing us richness. That's the number of individual crops that are grown, in this case, in counties across the US. And we can see this sort of westward expansion of agricultural production, but then also this pretty pronounced decrease in the number of different crops that are grown in each county from 1940 to 2017. This Crossley says represents a decrease from 88% of counties growing more than 10 crops in 1940 to about 2% in 2017. This is a pretty big decrease in our diversity of our cropping systems. And more in the sort of ecosystem services realm, there's been a lot of work looking at biodiversity and then ecosystem function. And generally, this paper from Cardinal and colleagues from 2012 puts up these consensus statements from scouring the literature, and they find that biodiversity effects are really pretty consistent across different types of organisms and ecosystems, which suggests that there are these sort of underlying principles that dictate how communities of organisms are organized and how they influence the functioning of ecosystems. But of course, they note that there are exceptions to these statements, and that would be worthwhile to explore the boundaries that constrain these effects. And in this same paper, one of the things they point out is that for agricultural systems, the evidence is pretty mixed. And this is particularly true when we look at the diversity of species that are grown in cropping systems, as opposed to, say, genetic diversity. So when I came onto the scene here, I was interested in thinking about these relationships between diversity and ecosystem function, ecosystem performance, specifically for agricultural systems, right? And for agricultural systems at scale, right? So there's this theory in ecosystem science that says that as we increase, go back here, that as we increase diversity, we should see this corresponding increase relatively quickly in ecosystem performance, ecosystem services, and that the slope is pretty steep when we're looking at kind of smaller scales. But then as we move outwards toward more landscape scales, thinking about tens and hundreds of kilometers in area, we see that it takes a lot more effort, a lot more increase in diversity to achieve these same sort of increases in function. At least that's the idea. And that for agricultural systems in particular, some of the ways that we manage those systems further push that curve down from that sort of 3 position to the 4 position. And so that's sort of the area I'm interested in. And wanted to start off by thinking about ecosystem function, ecosystem performance in terms of something that is of importance for farmers. And if we want to change how our agricultural systems are performing, we need to show something about productivity. So wanted to look at crop yields, which are available from USDA on a county scale, going back quite a ways in time. And to look at diversity, then we use the cropland data layer from USDA, which is available back to 2008. And we use this cropland data layer, which classifies the landscape according to different land uses and crop types. We use this to calculate these different diversity metrics for counties in the US over time. So what you see on the screen here is Shannon Diversity Index. This is a common metric that includes both considerations of the number of unique types of crops that are grown, but also then the relative proportions, the sort of evenness of area of those different crops that are on the landscape. Where then a value of 3 indicates higher diversity, that's sort of your darker green colors. And so we took our crop yield data and our calculated diversity metrics, and we put together some models. These are models that then look at the effect of diversity on yields. And we account for things like growing degree days, precipitation, soil type, the extent of irrigation, and then there are some county effects and temporal effects thrown into these models as well. But generally what we see is that for corn and winter wheat, the purple and the yellow, as our level of diversity increases along the x-axis here, we have 2 different diversity metrics showing here. But as diversity increases, generally we see an increase in yield. So higher landscape diversity was pretty consistently associated with higher yields for wheat and for corn, not for soy. Soy just tends to be flat and have almost no response. And the magnitude of this effect is about equivalent to about a 10 to 15% increase over average yields in those kind of upper echelon counties in terms of diversity. Now there's some consistencies and variation, of course, in this relationship. The direction of the trends here is pretty consistent for other diversity metrics. We have diversity metrics that are richness, just the count of crops, Shannon Diversity Index, which is crops and evenness of distribution on the landscape, and lots of other kind of variance along the lines of evenness and count of different unique crops. But generally, they all have the same sort of trends. A state level model just for Kansas, we also saw a similar kind of trends as we saw for our national level models. But we did see that then the shape of those curves and the magnitude varies a lot across metrics. In some cases, we saw that the effect then was about 50% less. So we're talking about a 5% maximum increase in yields. It's a pretty big difference. We also found that configuration matters. There's a lot of work on this, thinking about biodiversity of particular organisms as well, thinking about it's not just what you have on the landscape, the different crop types you have, but how they're arranged on the landscape that matters. And so in this figure here, we're showing the complexity of configuration, where the purple lines are indicating low complexity of configuration. So think like really large rectangular fields, all planted in the same crop. And then the yellow would be really high complexity of configuration. So this would be something like these really squiggly kind of irregularly shaped fields, maybe sort of along riparian field banks or following topographic contours. And we find this is for wheat, that it's really those sort of moderate configuration complexity counties that have the strongest effect with diversity, where we see increases of up to about 20% over average levels when you have both high diversity and a sort of moderate configuration complexity. And of course, we also find that the crop matters, right? So that the paper from Cardinal et al. Says, hey, it's really consistent, these biodiversity effects, but there are exceptions. And yes, we see that certain crops seem to be exceptions to this rule. And so even on this relatively kind of small scale study, we're looking at this and saying, gosh, there's a lot of different things that could give us a different idea of what diversity means for ecosystem function in agricultural landscapes. So can we put some bounds on this? How consistent are these relationships really? Because we know that the metrics have different sensitivities. They provide slightly different nuance of interpretation. In our original set of models, we focused our diversity metrics focus on species diversity because the cropland data layer puts a lot of effort into distinguishing between different crop types. So we have corn, popcorn, sweet corn, tomatoes, potatoes, oats, rye, etc. But then for our sort of natural and semi-natural habitat, we just have grassland, right? Deciduous forest. Not a whole lot of differentiation there. But theory about diversity frequently says that one of the reasons why diversity should improve ecosystem function is because we have this functional diversity, right? We have different functional classes performing different tasks that are complementary. So we decided to reclassify our land use according to the functionality of different land cover types as opposed to focusing on crop species. We also know that we may have different physiological responses for different crop species. So we ran additional models, looking not just at corn, wheat, and soy, but also then looking at hay and alfalfa to give us better representation of some of the biggest commodity crops across the US. And for which we have pretty consistent and a lot of data. And then we also know that different study extents can have varying effects on the results that we see. So looking at crop diversity versus diversity of the entire landscape could produce different results here, but also examining, say, this effect for the heartland region might provide us with something different than looking at this for, say, the southern seaboard region of the US. So to sort of get at this idea of like, well, how consistent are these relationships? Can we put some bounds on this? We ran more than 200 different models looking at 5 crops, 5 different metrics, and then we had like 6 different ways of calculating those metrics using different types of classifications and scopes and extents. And took those 200 models which are Bayesian models. So the output is a posterior distribution. So it's a probabilistic distribution. And for each of those 200 models, we're able to combine those different distributions to result in a single overall, across all 200 conditions, probability distribution for the effects. And generally, what we see is not what I showed you in the previous models, where we had this like 10% increase in yield. We don't see any significant effects, but what we do see is sort of a slight trending up. I'll note here that the dots here are the 50th percentile of the effect. The gray dashed line here, the dashed line represents a standard credibility interval. And then the shading indicates increasing or decreasing confidence in the actual estimate, going all the way up to a 95% credibility limit. So the only one thing that I can take that I feel a little bit good about with this is that it's not showing the relationship going down, right? It shows it going up a little bit. And decided to look at this, and putting everything in one basket is maybe not a fair representation of the actual effects of landscape diversity on crop yields as an ecosystem service. So we decided to kind of parse this out into some of these different ways of thinking about these metrics to see what's really producing this uncertainty. So in this plot, we're looking at different classification methods here. So we have our distributions for the effects when we use the cropland data layer. That's the CDL in red. And this is the land use classification that really emphasizes different species and different types of crops. And then in black, we have the reclassified land use according to kind of functional groups. And so we see a lot of overlap in these distributions, right? Remember, it's also including in here 5 different crops, 5 different metrics. So there is going to be a lot of uncertainty in these, but we can see that when we have the cropland data layer classification, we tend to see a little bit stronger trend. So our models that are more focused on differentiating between species tend to show us a little bit more positive effect of diversity, which is not entirely what I was expecting. I'm also kind of split this out by crops. I'm not showing you the hay and alfalfa sorry, I'm not showing you the soy and alfalfa in this model. It gets a little busy. Though soy and alfalfa both generally are pretty unresponsive, no matter what we do. But corn, hay, and wheat are generally show positive trends with between landscape diversity and yields. Hay shows the smallest magnitude of effect, but is the most consistent and has the smallest kind of confidence bands on here. Wheat is shown in brown, gives us the strongest effects, but has a lot more variability in that. And then this is splitting it out to look across the different metrics. So again, we have a whole lot of overlap across some of these distributions for the different types of metrics. One thing I'll point out here is that these 2 lines that are flat are richness and RPR, which is relative percent richness. Both of these are based almost entirely on just the number of unique crops in a county. And these are both not just flat, but they have very wide confidence bands. So there's something different going on with those. And this is a little bit in contrast to what we had expected, because we saw previously for corn and wheat that there was a positive relationship between richness and yield. So I wanted to break that down a little bit and think about what is going on with, in particular, like wheat. We saw really strong effects between diversity and yield in some of our previous models. What's going on? Why do we have a lot of uncertainty in that bound? And what we saw is that for winter wheat in particular, we have this strong sensitivity to the type of metric being used. So we have 3 metrics that all trend up, have a positive relationship, and then richness, and relative percent richness, it's very, very flat kind of metric. We could contrast that with something like hay, where we don't have very steep positive slopes, but everything really trends up consistently. And if I break this down even further and say, well, what is it about richness, these richness metrics that's throwing things off? I can look at our models where we're just looking at winter wheat and for the richness metric. And we see that the big confidence bounds on that effect are really due to differences in the classification system. So the red and black here are using the cropland data layer. So that crop-specific land use classification, when we use that, we see a positive relationship between richness and yields for winter wheat. But if we use our functionally reclassed land use to calculate diversity in terms of richness, we see actually a negative relationship here. Hay, on the other hand, we still see consistent positive slopes. The reclassified metrics don't show as strong of an effect as we do with the cropland data layer based metrics, but we still see a positive slope. So it's not just something about richness, it's some combination of specific metrics with specific crops, or perhaps the locations in which specific crops are grown. And along with some of the variability that we see just from the different kinds of metrics that are used, there's differences in the actual sample. We see differences in the sample and the scope and extent of what we use to do the study. So there's a lot of concern with some of these metrics that you might be seeing what's a size effect here, where if you can imagine if you had a very large county and a very small county, you would be able to have a higher likelihood of having greater diversity in a very large county just by virtue of the fact that there's more area to put different kinds of land uses. So these metrics are somewhat sensitive to actual size of the area that you're using to calculate the metric. So we decided to look only at the sort of average-ish. So we're really focused on the interquartile range of county size. So literally looking at county areas, and we drop out all the really small counties and all the really big counties to get rid of some of those size effects. Here we're looking at winter wheat effect for the diversity metric D, which is Shannon diversity entropy. So this is a mixture again of crop types and the proportion of those crop types across the county area. And we see a pretty strong effect with pretty narrow confidence interval. From one end of the diversity spectrum to the next, we see really a 20% difference in yields across here, which is much stronger than what we see for most of the other models. If we take the same crop, winter wheat, and same metric, but we look only at the heartland region in the US, we similarly see this increasing trend with relatively narrow confidence intervals, but the magnitude of the effect is much smaller size. And then if we go a little further and contrast that with a different region, if we focus only on the Northern Great Plains region, we see virtually nothing. Now, of course, keeping in mind that we may have sort of a different range of diversity values within these different sort of regions that are maybe influencing this. But nonetheless, so we look at this, and one of the things that we can look at is it's really hard to pin down on what the actual effects of, say, increasing landscape diversity would be on crop production. Generally, though, I think we could say that there's probably not a negative relationship, and that's about as far as we can really confidently get. But we do see these sort of interesting nuances in terms of thinking about how do we even measure this and how can we be more consistent and reproducible in the results that we produce. And so there are, of course, other reasons other than the potential for, say, increasing production for wanting to increase the diversity of agricultural systems. It could be economic reasons, could be resilience and yield stability reasons, but generally there's been a lot of noise in the area about trying to move towards increased diversity of agricultural systems and cropping systems. Now, there's been a lot of work that looks at the different factors that play a role in changing how we make decisions, how farmers make decisions about what technologies to adopt or what practices to adopt, say rotations, things of that nature. We wanted to really focus in here on thinking about the diversity of cropping systems and across sort of larger landscapes. So not just thinking about what's happening on individual farms, but across entire kind of regions. And so to look at this, our team picked out two sets of counties, one in the southern seaboard region, that would be Bertie and Washington counties in North Carolina, and another set of counties in the Prairie Gateway region in the Great Plains, so Ellsworth County in Kansas and Nuckolls County in Nebraska. And we picked these counties to be sort of close to each other in space. They have very similar growing seasons, temperature and precipitation profiles, soil and topography. There's a lot of similarities there. Demographics are very similar as well. But the major difference is that the diversifying counties, Ellsworth and Bertie, have been, they've been on this long-term, more than a decade-long trajectory of diversifying their cropping system, whereas the Nuckolls and Washington have been simplifying over time. And so our team conducted 50 interviews across these counties, talked to farmers, but also extension agents, went to co-ops, and asked not just about how farmers were making decisions for their individual farms, which was relevant, but what they saw as then the factors that were shaping change across their county in recent years. And then the usual suspects sort of came out to play. So these would be things like economic factors, market factors, policy factors, biophysical conditions, social, technical, management kind of factors. And all these factors and sort of the logic that applied to decision making was pretty consistent across the contexts, both across these different regions and then also across the diversifying and simplifying trajectories. So they don't really explain why one place would maybe be diversifying versus simplifying. What that really came down to, the conclusions that we arrived at, is that a lot of this is driven, the differences in whether a county becomes diversifying or simplifying really boils down to these very highly localized differences. For example, this is Bertie and Washington counties in North Carolina. You can see they're adjacent. They're very similar counties in a lot of ways, but they do have different kind of soil profiles and different topography, elevation differences across them. And so that led to things where you just had different types of crops that were suitable in different places, right? So pretty clear and obvious differences here. Like tobacco doesn't like wet feet, which means that we had a lot of tobacco production in Bertie County, but not in Washington County, which had this really rich, moist, organic soil. And then when we take these sort of local scale differences into account, and then place on top of that these macro scale changes that apply uniformly across both of these counties evenly. So for example, these tobacco and peanut quotas, which made every small farm possible. When we apply that macro policy on top of these local differences, we end up with these sort of split in trajectories. So in Washington County, which was the simplifying county, you had people say that, you know, it didn't affect me at all. These quotas ending didn't affect me because I didn't grow tobacco. You also had people in Washington County say things like, well, I had a neighbor that grew tobacco, but they just got out of it and decided to only grow corn and beans because of the loss of the tobacco quotas. Meanwhile, in Bertie, which is the more diversified, the diversifying county, you found instances where the loss of those quota systems actually led to increasing diversity because they had to transition to something new. So you had tobacco farmers that started growing vegetables or clary sage or even things like cucumbers for a new pickle factory that had sort of moved into the area. So the place that had perhaps a slightly more diverse background already tended to get more diverse given these sort of macro scale changes than the place that was a little bit more simplified to begin with. So we have this strong sort of path dependence. And if we're thinking about ways that we can move towards increasing diversity of agricultural systems, this path dependence, I think, is something to really start paying attention to, right? How local biophysical characteristics and then this inertia that comes from the legacy of what you have done, but also your sunk costs in terms of mechanization and infrastructure. These are really important and shape then how you respond to these macro scale changes that then lead to shifts to become increasingly diverse or increasingly simplified. And so this area where thinking about these sort of this inertia and this idea of infrastructure is the direction I'm sort of moving in now, really thinking about something that a Kansas farmer told me, that if we think about something outside of diversity of just the farm or even the agriculture aspects of the landscape, we need to be thinking about having a more diverse rural landscape overall that has good schools and industry and other sources of economic activity in the community. Because if you have those things, you'll have an opportunity to have some economic resilience and you are able to take risks and diversify into other things. So this idea that we can't, we need to start thinking about having a more diverse rural landscape overall in order to get diversification on farm. All right, I just thank you for your time, and I want to make sure that I thank my collaborators, awesome team from this USDA grant that funded that, and that will continue to work with me on our new NSF project.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson, for that insightful presentation. And at this time, we will transition into a Q&A session. And remember to everyone, and please submit your questions using the Q&A feature, and I will present them to Dr. Nelson for discussion. Okay. Okay, so I do see a question here. So what about the role of SWCDs? You're on mute.
Sorry, can you spell that out for me? SWCDs. Oh, yes, thank you. Soil and water conservation districts. We did talk to some people that were affiliated with soil and water conservation districts. They talked a lot about the interplay between mostly in the Prairie Gateway crop rotation and cover cropping, and diversity, and thinking more about this sort of temporal aspect of diversity as opposed to just spatial diversity, which has been our focus here. So we did see that as a pretty big factor in the interviews, where there was a lot of discussion about, well, we may not be able to add another, say, commodity crop to our to what we're doing, but we can start adding cover cropping to increase the sort of temporal diversity aspect.
There's another questions here.
So how can we change the views of the farmers to overcome inertia and cognitive barriers to transitions? So that's a good question. And so I didn't talk about some other work we have where we're showing that seeing some evidence of sort of a and now the word is going to leave my mind, but we have a lot of farmers here that are interested in doing some of these things, but they just aren't able to implement it, right? So there's this disparity between what they want to do and what then they're actually able to do. So some of it is cognitive barriers, but a lot of it also seems to be systematic, right? So you can't achieve all the things that you want to do. So that's one aspect of it. The inertia, the cognitive barriers, I'm not really sure. So what we're really seeing though is that it's these legacy effects that really drive things. But we don't necessarily have, I think, a great handle on what those actually mean and how we get around some of these barriers. A lot of, I think some of the farmers we would talk to would say that some of these cognitive barriers would sort of naturally be taken care of by the new generation of incoming farmers who are a little more open to some of this. But then we also talked to lots of older farmers as well who are open to this, to diversification, as long as it made economic sense, right? So if we can figure out some ways to sort of get the economic alignment, or even thinking about the well-being of their community as a whole alignment, I think that'll go a long way towards overcoming those barriers. So let's see, do we feel any pressure to swap perfectly valid terms like diversity for something like variety? I'd say not yet. I think, to be perfectly frank, there are some challenges with the word diversity just in and of itself, without even any political pressure, because it doesn't have a single meaning, right? Which I think the work that we've done looking at the different metrics already highlights this, right? So switching to something that's like variety might I haven't felt any pressure to do that so far. But then I think that might also play then into, well, what does that mean for the different types of metrics that we use? Because we do see big differences, meaningful differences across the different metrics. And if variety means just the number of different crops, well, the number of different crops, or also richness, is one of the metrics that shows the greatest uncertainties and the greatest variability, which I think is a pretty big challenge to overcome there.
I actually have a follow-up question. That so what lessons can we learn from the historical changes in agricultural land use that can help guide future policy and conservation efforts?
Yeah, and well, I can't give you any extraordinarily concrete answers to that, because my work in that is thinking about historical trends is really just starting up. But I can tell you what I'm hoping to see is really the relationship between sort of the level of community resources and support and what we actually have on the landscape around those areas. So if we can see if there are ways in which providing support for the community goes hand in hand with providing support for the agricultural systems, I think that gives us a different sort of entryway or different approach to how we try to diversify, right? Rather than just putting money into the hands of farmers and saying, hey, we want you to grow new things, right? We saying, okay, we're going to do this, but we're also going to help out by providing other economic opportunities for your spouses and partners who might work in this area as well, even if they aren't on farm. So I think that's one thing. Definitely that can come from some of the historical that I'm hoping to find from some of the historical analysis. I know some people who have looked at the historical data over time, other than just showing that we have these big decreases in crop diversity over time, are also showing things that maybe are positive aspects, where maybe by having sort of centralization or regionalization of crop types, we're limiting some pest and disease spread. Right, so there's a balance perhaps that needs to happen between diversifying our systems, but then also making sure that we have sort of climate appropriate crop systems that are also then really limiting the transfer of diseases and pests.
Thank you. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat or Q&A features. So if there are no further questions, and we will conclude today's session. Thank you, Dr. Nelson, for sharing your research and valuable insights with us today. And thank you all attendees for your engagement and thoughtful questions. Please stay tuned for our upcoming webinars in our CAFNA Research Council webinar series. And thank you again, Dr. Nelson, and thank you all for joining us today. Bye-bye.